What is dopamine, and what role does it play in our lives other than the addiction side of things that we're going to address here today?
Yeah, so dopamine is a chemical that is released in our brains. It has a number of different functions. It's very important to movement. In fact, it's the depletion of dopamine in a part of the brain called the substantia nigra that is responsible for Parkinson's disease, which is a movement disorder. Dopamine is also released in another part of our brain, which is deep in our emotion centers of the brain, which is called the reward circuit. And dopamine is really important for the experience of reward, motivation, and pleasure. It's not the only chemical in the brain that's important to reward, motivation, and pleasure, but it is probably the final common pathway of all reinforcing drugs and behaviors. There is some science suggesting that dopamine may be even more important for motivation than it is for actual pleasure, because those are slightly different things, right? Our motivation to get something is slightly different from the euphoria that we feel once we've gotten it and we're ingesting it. And there's a famous series of experiments where scientists sort of re-engineered a rat so that it didn't have dopamine receptors in certain key parts of its brain. And what they found was that in those rats, the rat, if you gave it food, would eat it and seem to get pleasure from it. But if you made the rat work to get the food, like if you put the food some distance away, or if you made the rat have to press a lever to get the food, the rat would basically starve to death. It wasn't motivated to do the work to get the reward. So dopamine is really important to the experience of pleasure, but it's also equally or even more important to the experience of motivation to go and get that reward.
And is that motivation, is that then tied to the movement part? Because I don't think I've ever heard dopamine associated with movement. Can you speak more to that side?
Yeah, so exactly. It makes perfect sense that dopamine would be involved in pleasure motivation and also movement, because for most of human existence, we have had to move our bodies to go get our reward. Today, that's no longer true, which is part of the problem that we have now. But even the most primitive nematode or worm will release dopamine in response to food in its environment and in response to the locomotion to get the food. So for many, many millions of years of evolution across species, dopamine is related to motivation, pleasure, movement, and how those things link together.